JD Vance attacked Canada. Carney just shut him down. In a private room in Southampton, New York, in front of an audience of political donors, the Vice President of the United States picked up a microphone and started talking about the Prime Minister of Canada like he was describing a rival he half admired and mostly wanted to laugh at. That was Wednesday, August the 19th. According to audio obtained by the Canadian press, JD Vance told the room that Mark Carney is a very sweet guy, that the two of them get along fine, and then, in the same breath, mocked him for what Vance called puffing his chest out and claiming he was going to out-tough Donald Trump at the negotiating table. Vance told the donors it was hilarious because, in his telling, Canada climbed down on a lot of issues while presenting the outcome back home as a win. That single recording, leaked from a fundraiser, most Canadians were never supposed to hear about, is where this story really starts. But it is nowhere near where it ends. Because 5 days later, in a manufacturing plant in Brewer, Maine, the same vice president stood in front of a very different crowd and did something that lit up newsrooms from Ottawa to Washington within the hour. Talking about dairy tariffs, trade imbalances, and what he called Canada's unfair treatment of Maine farmers, Vance referred to Canada as a state. He caught himself almost immediately. Freudian slip, he said, correcting himself on the spot, adding that Canada is, of course, a country. But the moment had already happened. On camera, in front of reporters, days after Donald Trump himself had posted online that Canada wants the benefits of being a state without actually being one. Ottawa noticed. Washington noticed. And by Monday, the fallout from that single sentence was dominating headlines across two countries. This is a story about a trade relationship between two of the closest allies on Earth that has spent the better part of 2 years sliding toward open hostility, about a vice president whose remarks keep landing him in Canadian headlines for all the wrong reasons, and about a prime minister who has built much of his early political identity on refusing, again and again, to let Washington dictate the terms of that relationship. To understand why a single word out of JD Vance's mouth could dominate the news cycle in Ottawa, you have to go back to where this all began, because none of this happened in a vacuum. Donald Trump has been talking about Canada as if it were something less than a sovereign country since the earliest days of his second term. Almost from the moment he was sworn in, he began floating the idea, sometimes as a joke, sometimes with a straighter face, that Canada should simply become the 51st state of the United States. Canadian officials, including a Radio Canada report that surfaced the details of a private call between the two leaders, confirmed Trump raised the idea directly with Carney on a phone call in the spring of last year. Carney's answer, delivered publicly and repeated whenever the subject came up again, was blunt. As he said to anyone who has raised the issue with him in private or in public, including the president himself, it will never happen. That line became something close to a signature position for Carney, repeated so often that by the time he faced voters in a federal election, the entire campaign had effectively turned into a referendum on who could stand up to Trump. Carney did not start out as an elected politician. He came into the Prime Minister's office from a background in central banking, having led both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, a resume that gave him a technocrat's credibility on economic matters, but no natural base of retail political support. What he did have, when he took over the Liberal Party from Justin Trudeau, was a moment. Trump's threats against Canadian sovereignty, his tariff talk, his repeated jabs about the 51st state had scrambled Canadian politics in ways almost nobody had predicted. The Conservative Party under Pierre Poilievre had spent more than a year comfortably ahead in the polls, riding voter frustration over inflation and the unpopularity of the Trudeau government. Then, Trump's rhetoric turned the ballot question into something else entirely. Who do you trust to protect Canada from the country next door? Carney rode that question to victory in a general election, turning what looked like a guaranteed Conservative win into a Liberal government. None of this is happening in a vacuum, stretching back only a few weeks either. The trade war between the two countries goes back further than this month's headlines suggest, to February the 1st, 2025, when Trump first announced sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, a 25% duty on most imports alongside a 10% tariff aimed at Canadian energy exports. Canada, still under Trudeau at that point, hit back with retaliatory tariffs of its own on $30 billion of American goods, a figure that escalated to $155 billion within a matter of weeks as the dispute widened. From there, the fight expanded into steel, aluminum, and automobiles, with both the federal government in Ottawa and several provincial governments rolling out support programs to cushion Canadian industries against the shock. There was even a legal twist along the way. In early 2026, the Supreme Court of the United States struck down a chunk of Trump's emergency tariff powers in a case called Learning Resources versus Trump, ruling the administration had overstepped the authority granted under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That ruling slowed some of the tariff regime down, but it did not end the broader standoff, and by this past weekend, new 50% tariffs were hitting close to $28 billion of Canadian goods. Everything from cement and honey to alcohol and textiles, a package that on its own represents roughly 5% of everything Canada ships south of the border. It also helps to remember what Carney's resume actually consists of, because it shapes how he handles moments like this one. Before he was ever a candidate for office, Carney led the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis and later became the first non-British person to run the Bank of England, a pair of jobs that put him in the room for some of the tensest economic negotiations of the past 2 decades. That background gives him a particular register when he talks about tariffs and trade retaliation. Measured, technical, more inclined to cite growth figures and supply chains than to trade insults. It's part of why his sharpest public lines, the subsidiary comment, the flat refusal to entertain annexation talk, land is pointed precisely because they are delivered without the kind of theatrical anger that might otherwise dominate a political news cycle. Carney doesn't raise his voice in these exchanges. He restates the position, again, in the same even tone, and lets the other side's rhetoric do the work of looking overheated by comparison. Once in office, in his own right, Carney kept using the same language. On a swing through Europe early in his term, meeting King Charles in London and President Macron in Paris, he told reporters that Canada can stand up for its own sovereignty, a message aimed as much at voters back home as at the leaders he was meeting abroad. When Trump, during that same period, referred to him as the future governor of Canada, a title Trump had also thrown at Trudeau, Carney let the insult sit rather than escalate, but he never let a version of it pass without a rebuttal on the substance. Canada, in his framing, was a sovereign nation negotiating with another sovereign nation, not a subordinate territory waiting for instructions from Washington. That framing is the thread that connects everything that has happened since, right up through this week's blow-up with Vance and Brewer. By the middle of this August, the two countries appeared to be closing in on some kind of deal. Trump had threatened, on August the 19th, to slap 50% tariffs on a wide array of Canadian goods at midnight. Hours before that deadline hit, he announced he was pushing it back, saying the two sides had reached an agreement, subject to what he called the finalization of documents. Canada's Trade Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, said publicly that the country's supply management system for dairy, long one of the most contentious issues between the two countries, remained entirely intact under whatever framework had been discussed. For a few days, there was a sense that months of grinding, exhausting negotiation might finally produce something both governments could live with. It did not last. The deal, whatever it actually contained, fell apart before a fresh deadline on Friday, and by the following Monday, Trump had escalated rather than extended an olive branch. He announced plans to raise tariffs on Canadian-made vehicles to 50% starting on the 1st of January 2027, on top of 50% tariffs on roughly $20 billion of other Canadian goods that had already taken effect over the weekend. Carney did not back down. Canada, he said, would respond with its own retaliatory tariffs on American goods, set to take effect on September the 8th. At a press conference addressing the collapse, Carney told reporters Canada remained open to talks, but only on terms that respected Canada's sovereignty, adding that when the Americans come to the table with the right attitude toward Canadian industries and a genuine partnership, Canada will be there too. He went further, rejecting outright what he described as an attitude at the table that treats Canada as a subsidiary of the United States, something he said plainly Canada is not going to accept. The economic reaction on the Canadian side was immediate, and according to the people whose job it is to model these things, genuinely worrying. Trevor Tome, an economics professor at the University of Calgary, told reporters that machinery and electronics exporters would take a sharp hit under the new round of duties, with furniture and textile producers also facing steep proportional damage, since nearly half of what they ship to the United States falls under the newly targeted categories. Tom separately estimated that continued 50% tariffs could cost Canada in the neighborhood of 90,000 jobs. Robert Kavcic, a senior economist at BMO, wrote in a note to clients that the breakdown in talks was the toughest shock to hit Canadian business confidence since the spring of 2025, arriving right as the economy had finally started showing signs of a real rebound, with Statistics Canada tracking solid growth in the second quarter of 2026 after 2 soft quarters before that. Bradley Saunders, North America economist at Capital Economics, warned clients in a note of his own that the re-escalation pushes Canada closer to a recession outright, particularly if Ottawa's own retaliatory tariffs trigger a further American response. The Canadian dollar slid on the news, and reports circulated of ordinary Canadians pulling American alcohol brands off store shelves in a kind of grassroots boycott, a small but telling sign of how far public sentiment has shifted since this dispute began. That was the backdrop when Vance flew to Maine. The Vice President has a personal stake in this fight that goes beyond ideology. Maine is a border state, and its dairy farmers have been squarely in the middle of the tariff dispute for months. Standing at a manufacturing company in Brewer called Compotech, Vance told the crowd that Canada and China have been, in his words, the 2 worst countries in the world when it comes to trade policy, a comparison meant to sting precisely because Canada is supposed to be an ally rather than a rival superpower. He said he expected unfair trade behavior from China, calling it America's biggest economic competitor, but that he did not expect it from Canada. Then he turned to dairy specifically, telling the room that Maine farmers shipping products north can face tariffs as high as 250% once they cross certain quota thresholds, while Canadian dairy producers face nothing comparable heading the other way. Canada's own published tariff schedule backs up the broad shape of that complaint. Under the trade agreement that replaced NAFTA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, a fixed quantity of American dairy products can enter Canada duty-free. But once that quota is exceeded, the tariff wall goes up fast, with some categories listed north of 200%. Vance argued that the imbalance is compounded by what he called Canada's role as a backdoor for Chinese goods, allowing Chinese products to slip into the North American market while facing far less scrutiny than American exports face heading into Canada. It was in the middle of fielding those questions that Vance made the remark that turned the appearance into a headline story on both sides of the border. Talking about the broader relationship, he told the room, quote, "We have to remember Canada is a state," and then, catching the words as they left his mouth, added, "Sorry, Freudian slip. That was actually an accident. Canada is a country." Reporters in the room and the wire services that picked up the audio afterward noted it was far from the only moment Vance stumbled over his words that day, but it was by far the one that traveled fastest, precisely because of what had already been said days earlier by his boss. Because this did not happen in isolation. Over the preceding weekend, Trump had posted on social media that Canada wants the benefits of being a state without actually being one. And on the Monday of Vance's Maine trip, Trump said publicly that Canada would no longer receive that treatment, tying the statement directly to his new tariff threats on autos and auto parts. Later that same Monday, Trump referred to Carney as governor again, reviving a nickname he had mostly set aside earlier in Carney's term when the two leaders were making a visible effort to keep the relationship cordial. Seen against that pattern, Vance's on-camera slip looked to a lot of observers less like an innocent verbal stumble, and more like a Freudian slip in the truest sense of the phrase. An accidental confession of how senior figures in the administration actually talk about Canada when the cameras are supposedly not paying close attention. Reaction across Canadian media was swift, much of it drawing a direct line between the private mockery caught on tape in Southampton, New York, 5 days earlier, and the public gaffe in Brewer, Maine, treating them as two data points in the same trend, rather than two unrelated incidents. If you're finding this kind of granular, sourced breakdown of the Canada-U.S. relationship useful, this channel is tracking every twist in this trade fight as it happens, and subscribing means you won't miss the next development, because based on the calendar alone, there is a lot more coming before this settles down. Let's go back briefly to that Southampton fundraiser, because it deserves more attention than a single quote about Carney's chest puffing. In that same recording, Vance offered a detailed account of the role played by Jamil Jivani, a Conservative member of Parliament from Ontario and one of Vance's closest personal friends going back years before either man held office. Vance told the donors that behind the scenes, Jivani, whom he described almost dismissively as this random MP who happens to have a good relationship with the administration, had actually been a highly effective advocate for Canadian interests in the negotiations, working channels that the official Canadian government team could not. Vance said he'd asked Jivani directly why he was helping a Liberal government he doesn't belong to, and that Jivani's answer amounted to simply caring whether Canada wins. According to Vance, Jivani proved useful specifically on issues where there was what he called a win-win, including energy security and automobile tariffs. In the same set of remarks, Vance turned to Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative Party leader who has spent the past year and a half trying to recover from his election loss to Carney, and dismissed him flatly as a non-entity in the trade negotiations. That comment did not sit quietly in Ottawa. Poilievre, asked directly by reporters about Vance's characterization of Jivani's back-channel diplomacy, said he had instructed every one of his MPs to use whatever contact they had in Washington to fight for Canada and Canadian jobs, and that any Canadian, in his view, should be doing the same. It was a pointed answer, avoiding any direct rebuttal of being called a non-entity while reframing Jivani's outreach as simply patriotic rather than embarrassing. It's worth noting that Jivani's friendship with Vance had already been a political liability once during the general election campaign, when Liberal-aligned ads reportedly circulated doctored images placing Jivani and Vance together, an episode Jivani has since described as frustrating, and Poilievre had earlier drawn a line publicly, telling reporters back in February that Jivani speaks for himself while Poilievre speaks for the party, after Jivani described Canadians' anger over the trade war as something close to an overreaction. This is also not the first time allies abroad have noticed the pattern of language coming out of the Trump administration toward Canada. French President Emmanuel Macron, commenting separately on Trump's repeated 51st state framing, said the rhetoric shows the United States turning away from its own allies. a remark that made its way into Canadian coverage precisely because it validated what Carney's government had been arguing for months, that this is not simply loose talk but a pattern serious enough for other G7 leaders to comment on publicly. Add that to warnings from a former Canadian ambassador to the United Nations about the direction of the relationship, and to Ontario Premier Doug Ford's own repeated public commentary on what he calls the one thing Trump has managed to do for Canada, namely unify a fractured country against a common external pressure. And you start to see how thoroughly this dispute has seeped into nearly every layer of Canadian public life, well beyond trade ministers and tariff schedules. All of this matters because it shows the story is bigger than one vice president and one prime minister trading barbs from a distance. There is an entire secondary track of Canadian domestic politics tangled up in this fight, with a sitting government negotiating officially through its trade minister, a friendly backbench MP negotiating unofficially through a personal friendship with the vice president, and an opposition leader trying to walk a line between claiming credit for tariff-free trade as a goal and not looking like he is undermining his own government's negotiating position on the world stage. Reaction to the wider spectacle, meanwhile, has been sharp on the editorial pages. The Globe and Mail's editorial board argued plainly that Carney was right to call the American negotiating strategy a power play, pointing to the way Trump had triumphantly announced a deal that did not actually exist yet, and to what the paper called Vance's mockery of the Prime Minister, as evidence that the goal of the American approach is subjugation rather than genuine cooperation. The same editorial cited Vance's own words from a separate speech, in which he had acknowledged that the whole point of the pressure campaign is to change Canada's behavior in what Vance called a Trumpian direction. Whatever one makes of that framing, it reflects a broader current running through Canadian commentary this week, a sense that the rhetoric coming out of the Vice President's office isn't incidental noise around the trade dispute, but a fairly direct statement of intent. Public reaction online has been messier and more divided than the editorial pages, which is worth being honest about rather than pretending otherwise. Some commentators have sided firmly with Carney's sovereignty argument, framing Vance's main comments as proof that Washington sees Canada as something to be pushed around rather than negotiated with as an equal. Others, including some Canadian voices, have argued Vance has a point on the narrower question of dairy tariffs and market access, and that focusing on the word slip distracts from a legitimate grievance about a supply management system that does shield Canadian producers from foreign competition. Both of those positions have shown up loudly in the comment sections underneath nearly every article on this story, and neither one is unfair to acknowledge on its own terms. So where does that leave the actual trade relationship? As of right now, the 50% American tariffs on roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods are already in effect, having taken hold over the weekend before Vance's main appearance. The threatened 50% tariff on Canadian-made vehicles and auto parts is not in effect yet, scheduled instead for the 1st of January 2027, giving both sides a window, however narrow, to find another off-ramp before it kicks in. Canada's own retaliatory tariffs on American goods are set to take effect on September the 8th, which, depending on when you're watching this, may have already happened, or may still be a matter of days away. Vance himself, even while delivering some of his sharpest lines in Brewer, left the door open to a deal, telling the audience he still wants to be respectful of a process he described as ongoing, and that, as recently as the tariff delay a week earlier, he believed the two sides had actually reached an agreement before what he called unreasonable, last-minute demands blew it up again. That detail is worth sitting with because it means neither government, publicly at least, is treating this as a closed door. It is an open, ongoing, and genuinely unresolved negotiation, one that both sides say they would still like to finish, even as the public rhetoric surrounding it gets sharper by the week. It's also worth being upfront about what is not yet settled, because a story moving this fast produces claims faster than they can always be checked. What actually changed in the tariff delay deal reached around August the 19th has not been fully detailed by either government. LeBlanc's assurance that dairy supply management remained intact is the clearest public confirmation of any specific term, and beyond that, much of what was or wasn't conceded remains undisclosed. Whether the retaliatory tariffs set for September the 8th will actually take effect as scheduled or get pushed back the way the original American deadline was is not something that can be stated as fact today, only as the plan currently on the books. And the private fundraiser audio, while provided to and reported by the Canadian Press, a well-established wire service, still represents one recording of one event, filtered through a source who chose to share it, which is a detail worth keeping in mind, even though there is no indication the recording's authenticity has been disputed by anyone named in it. If you want the clearest possible picture of where this goes next, the smartest thing you can do is stick with coverage that's actually tracking the paper trail here, tariff by tariff and deadline by deadline, instead of just the viral clips. And subscribing puts you in exactly that position the moment the next deadline hits. Before we get to the harder question of what all this actually means, it's worth pausing on one more thing. Stories like this one move fast with new statements, new deadlines, and new leaked recordings landing every few days. And the difference between catching a development the day it happens versus a week later is often the difference between understanding the full context and just seeing an out-of-context clip. That's the entire reason to hit subscribe on a channel that's actually walking through the sourcing rather than just chasing the loudest headline of the day. Let's talk about the substance underneath the personalities for a moment, because it is easy to get lost in Vance's slip of the tongue and miss what the actual dispute is about. American frustration, articulated by both Trump and Vance, centers on three specific grievances. First, dairy. Canada's supply management system, which uses tariff rate quotas to protect domestic dairy producers, allows a fixed volume of American dairy in duty-free before steep tariffs, in some categories reported north of 200%, kick in on anything beyond that quota. Second, autos and steel, where Trump has moved from threats to an actual escalation, setting a firm 50% tariff on vehicles and parts to begin at the start of 2027 if no new deal is reached before then. Third, and this is the newer and more geopolitically loaded complaint, the claim that Canada functions as an entry point for Chinese goods to reach the American market while avoiding tariffs the U.S. has placed directly on China. That last accusation ties the Canada dispute into the much larger American trade confrontation with Beijing, and it's a charge Ottawa has not directly rebutted in the reporting available so far, which is itself worth flagging as an open question rather than filling in with a guess. All of this is also unfolding against the backdrop of the broader continental trade agreement that governs Canada, the United States, and Mexico, which was built with a joint review mechanism roughly 6 years after it took effect, putting 2026 in play as a moment when all three governments are supposed to sit down and formally decide whether to keep the pact running as written, renegotiate pieces of it, or let it start winding down. That review clause sits underneath almost everything happening this month. Every tariff threat, every dairy complaint, and every reference to Canada as a subsidiary rather than a partner is, in one way or another, positioning for that larger conversation, which makes the timing of Vance's main comments look less like a random news cycle and more like an opening move in a much longer negotiation that both governments know is coming, regardless of how the next few weeks play out. On the Canadian side, the core grievance is less about any single tariff line and more about posture. Carney's public language, whether talking about a phone call with Trump, a trip to London and Paris, or a press conference addressing a blown deadline, keeps returning to the same idea. Canada will negotiate as a sovereign, equal partner, or it won't negotiate the terms Washington is asking for at all. That is the frame Canadian officials used when rejecting the idea that any deal should treat Canada as, in Carney's words, a subsidiary of the United States. It's also the frame that explains why a single word like state, uttered accidentally by a vice president in Maine, can dominate a news cycle in Ottawa in a way it might not if the exact same slip happened in almost any other bilateral relationship on Earth. The word touches the one nerve that has defined Carney's entire political rise. Zoom out even further, and this dispute sits inside a bigger story about how the second Trump administration has approached America's closest allies generally, treating trade leverage as a tool for behavioral change rather than simply commercial negotiation. Vance said as much himself in remarks separate from the main appearance, acknowledging the goal is to shift Canadian policy in what he called a Trumpian direction. Whether you view that as a defensible negotiating strategy or as exactly the kind of subjugation the Globe and Mail's editorial board accused the administration of pursuing probably depends more on where you already stood on Trump's broader approach to allies than on anything specific to this one dispute. That's a genuine values disagreement, not a factual one, and it's not this script's job to settle it for you. What can be said with confidence is this. Over the past several days, the Vice President of the United States has, in two separate settings, one private and leaked, one public and broadcast, described the Prime Minister of Canada in strikingly dismissive terms, mocked his negotiating posture to a room of donors, praised a friendly opposition backbencher as more useful than either the Prime Minister or the official opposition leader, and then, in front of cameras, referred to Canada itself as a state before catching the words as they left his mouth. Over that same stretch, the Canadian government has held its line publicly, insisting on sovereignty and rejecting any framing of Canada as subordinate to Washington, while simultaneously keeping the door open to more negotiation and warning it will respond to American tariffs with tariffs of its own. Both governments say they still want a deal. Neither has produced one yet. And the deadlines that matter, the January 2027 auto tariff and the September 8th Canadian retaliation, are both still live, both still capable of moving in either direction, depending on what happens in the coming days. To be completely transparent about the reporting behind this script, the core facts here are drawn from named on-record sources. The Canadian Press and CBC News, who obtained and reported the Southampton fundraiser audio. Global News, which covered both the fundraiser remarks and the Freudian slip moment in detail, including Trump's own social media posts about Canada's status, Time magazine, which laid out the timeline connecting the collapsed negotiations, the 50% tariffs, and Carney's subsidiary comment, Fox News, Yahoo News Canada, and Spectrum Local News, which each carried extended, on-the-record transcripts of Vance's remarks in Brewer, Maine, the Epoch Times, which reported Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc's comments on dairy supply management and Poilievre's on-record response to being asked about Giovanni, and the Globe and Mail's editorial board, whose commentary is clearly opinion journalism rather than straight news reporting, and is presented here as such. The economic figures cited here come from named analysts on record. Trevor Tome of the University of Calgary, Robert Kavchich of BMO, and Bradley Saunders of Capital Economics, as reported by BNN Bloomberg, along with CNBC's reporting on the Canadian dollar's reaction and the retaliatory tariff timeline. What remains genuinely unverified or still developing includes the exact terms of the brief tariff delay agreement reached in mid-August, whether Canada's September 8th retaliatory tariffs will proceed exactly as announced, whether the widely reported alcohol boycott reflects a broad or a narrow slice of Canadian consumers, and how the Canadian government will respond, if at all, beyond Poilievre's general comments, to being told by the Vice President of the United States that its own party leader is a non-entity in these talks. None of that uncertainty changes the core, well-documented facts. The tariffs that are already in effect, the ones scheduled for January 2027, the retaliation scheduled for September 8th, and the words both Vance and Carney have put on the public record. So here's the actual question worth sitting with, and it's one that genuinely does not have an obvious answer. Is what we're watching here just the normal ugly texture of hard-nosed trade negotiations between two governments that both have domestic audiences to perform for, the kind of tough talk that gets walked back the moment a deal is actually signed? Or is Vance's slip of the tongue in Brewer, Maine, exactly what a Freudian slip is supposed to reveal? An accidental glimpse at how the people running American foreign policy actually think about Canada's independence, dressed up the rest of the time in more careful language. Let us know where you land on that. And if you've been following the tariff fight closely enough to have a read on what happens after September the 8th, say so. Because the comment section under stories like this one has honestly been one of the more informed conversations happening around this whole dispute. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back the moment the next domino falls in this relationship, because on the current schedule, that will not be long.